Camping alone in the woods. Something watched us all night. Part 1. The fire crackled softly, its orange glow barely cutting through the thick veil of darkness that surrounded us. The woods were alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, distant owl hoots, and the occasional snap of a twig under some unseen creature's foot. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, insignificant, as if the forest itself was breathing, watching, waiting. I had always loved camping. The solitude, the connection to nature, the escape from the noise of everyday life. But this trip was different. This time, I wasn't alone. My best friend, Jake, had insisted on joining me. "You shouldn't go out there by yourself," he'd said, his voice tinged with concern. "It's not safe." I'd laughed it off at the time, but now, sitting here in the eerie silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We'd set up camp in a small clearing, just far enough from the trail to feel secluded but not so deep that we couldn't find our way back. The tent was pitched, the fire was lit, and we'd even managed to cook a decent meal over the flames. Everything should have been perfect. But as the night deepened, so did the unease that settled in my gut. It started with the feeling of being watched. You know that sensation, like a cold hand brushing the back of your neck? I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement, but there was nothing. Just shadows. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice cutting through the silence. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just feels weird out here tonight." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's the woods, man. It's supposed to feel weird." I wanted to believe him, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The first real sign that something was wrong came around midnight. We were sitting by the fire, talking about nothing in particular, when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more resonant, as if the sound itself was alive. Jake froze, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know. Maybe a bear." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears didn't sound like that. Bears didn't make your skin crawl or your breath catch in your throat. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sign of movement. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. The growl didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. "We should get some sleep," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though the thought of closing my eyes made my stomach churn. We doused the fire and crawled into the tent, zipping it shut behind us. The thin fabric offered little comfort, but it was better than nothing. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle, every creak of a branch, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there. But deep down, I knew better. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the tent. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sound was too deliberate, too intentional. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to Jake, who was lying beside me, wide awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through the tent. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The tapping continued, slow and steady, like someone, or something, was testing the fabric, probing for a way in. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of blood rushing in my ears. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice trembling. I wanted to argue, to tell him we were safer in the tent, but I couldn't. The fear was too much, too overwhelming. We grabbed our flashlights and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The clearing was empty, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the darkness. But as I swept my flashlight across the ground, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They were large, too large to be human, with long, claw-like toes that dug deep into the earth. And they were fresh. Part 2. We didn't speak as we packed up our gear, our movements hurried and frantic. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, as if whatever was out there was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hike back to the car was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound was amplified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, but there was only darkness. When we finally reached the car, I felt a surge of relief. We were going to make it. We were going to get out of here. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. No, 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 I muttered, trying again. But the car wouldn't start. Jake was already on his phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. We were trapped. And then, from the trees, we heard it, the growl. It was closer this time, so close that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. We didn't wait to see what was coming. We ran, abandoning the car and sprinting down the trail. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we stumbled into another clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. "We can hide in there," Jake said, his voice desperate. I wanted to argue, to tell him it was a bad idea, but the growl was getting louder, closer. We didn't have a choice. The door creaked open as we pushed our way inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. We barricaded the door with a heavy wooden table and collapsed onto the floor, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from outside, we heard it, the sound of something scratching at the walls. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there was trying to claw its way in. I could feel the walls of the cabin shaking, the wood splintering under the force. "We're not going to make it," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we'd find a way out, but I couldn't. The fear had taken hold, paralyzing me. And then, just as the door began to give way, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the blood rushing in my ears. "Is it gone?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. And then, from the corner of the room, we heard it, a soft, raspy whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Conclusion. We never made it out of the woods. The cabin, the car, the trail, it was all gone by morning. All that remained were the footprints, leading deeper into the forest. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the growl, the scratching, the whisper. And I know, deep down, that whatever was out there that night is still watching, waiting for its next victim. So if you ever find yourself camping alone in the woods, remember this story. And remember, you're never really alone.